Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of China Focus, the podcast where we shine a focus on the folks, the everyday people, their unique experiences, and the vibrant tapestry of life across China. I'm your host, Robert Jean.
And I'm Ella.
Okay, let's try and unpack this. There's this really striking thing happening online in China right now. A figure from deep in history, like over 1,000 years ago, is suddenly right at the center of intense discussion and, well, for many, some surprising praise.
It is remarkable to see. We're talking about Huang Chao, someone most people associate with the very, very end of the Tang dynasty. Died around 884 AD. The really unexpected part is that so many people online are revisiting his story today and, like you said, finding reasons to admire him.
Exactly. And what's behind this, sudden surge of interest? The conversations we've seen online seem to point towards a specific, fairly recent event. It's often called the Miss Dong incident. It seems like this incident really brought concerns about social stratification and maybe lack of opportunity into sharp focus for a lot of people.
That connection is really what makes this deep dive so relevant, I think. Our mission here is to understand the historical Huang Chao, what drove his rebellion all those centuries ago, and then try to explore why, according to these discussions happening now, his story is hitting such a nerve with people feeling, well, frustrated today.
Right. Let's dive into the history then. Who was Huang Chao?
Okay. Huang Chao was born around 835 AD. He came from a family involved in the salt trade over in Shandong, which meant they had some wealth.
So not exactly from the bottom rungs, but not necessarily the absolute top-tier aristocracy either?
Precisely. The historical accounts tell us he was educated, skilled in things like archery, swordsmanship, even wrote poetry. But here's a point that really jumps out in the current discussions. He repeatedly failed the imperial civil service exams. This was supposed to be the pathway to power, the legitimate one, but he just couldn't pass through it despite his background and, education.
That failure, that inability to get onto the official ladder despite having the means, that must have been incredibly frustrating. It makes me think of that famous poem of his, the Chrysanthemum poem, written after, another exam failure. It's
cited all the time in these discussions. And those lines, they paint such a vivid picture of ambition and maybe, a brewing desire for revenge. When autumn comes on the 9th month, 8th, and my flowers bloom, after them all others cease.
Powerful imagery.
And then their scent pierces Chang'an, the capital. And that final line, the whole city is covered in golden armor.
That golden armor, it feels like a pretty clear symbol of imperial ambition, right? Taking over.
It's definitely interpreted that way. And there's even an earlier poem mentioned from when he was younger, hinting at this. Something about being the head of all flowers and being naturally bestowed with a yellow robe.
The emperor's color.
Yeah.
So the ambition was there early on.
It seems so, yeah. Those early verses suggest it. But to really get why someone like Huang Chao, with his family's money and his education, couldn't just pass the exams and climb the ranks, we need to look at the state of the late Tang dynasty, smuggling operations.
Which, as you said, Huang Chao's family was actually involved in.
Exactly. It's a dynamic that gets highlighted in the current discussions too, how government control can sometimes fuel these illicit high-profit ventures.
And the court itself.
Deeply corrupt by most accounts. Eunuchs wielded huge unofficial power behind the scenes. Positions were often bought with bribes, or you got them through connections, which meant there was often a real lack of actual talent or competence in government.
Okay, so you've got a society where opportunity feels blocked by this corrupt, interconnected elite. Official channels are ineffective or maybe even rigged against outsiders. It sounds like a perfect storm brewing for resentment.
Absolutely. That sense of an entrenched elite, limited upward mobility for people outside the circle, regardless of their merit. That's a key historical takeaway here.
Which really sets the stage for the rebellion itself. Huang Chao eventually joins this uprising led by Wang Xianzi, starting around 875 AD, so about 1,150 years ago. What was their initial stated goal? Did they have one?
At the outset, yeah. The stated aims were framed in terms of social justice. Things like equalizing wealth and poverty, or making the poor rich.
Pretty noble ideals, at least how they presented it at the start. How did the rebellion actually unfold?
Well, it was long and incredibly brutal. Lasted for almost a decade. His forces moved across huge parts of the empire, capturing many cities and regions. They moved south first, attacked wealthy centers like Guangzhou, that was in 879 AD, over 1140 years ago.
Guangzhou. Accounts mention terrible violence there, right? Something about foreign merchants?
Yes, there are accounts mentioning a horrific massacre there. One report suggests over 200,000 Muslim, Jewish, and other foreign merchants were killed. Though it's important to note, other sources point out this specific massive number isn't widely corroborated in Chinese records from the time.
Right. A reminder that historical accounts, especially about numbers and violent events, can sometimes differ or might involve exaggeration.
Absolutely crucial point. So, from the south, his forces then turned back north again. The high point for him was capturing Chang'an, the imperial capital, in 881 AD. That's about 1144 years ago. The Tang emperor actually fled the city.
He took the capital itself, the heart of the empire. That's huge.
He was massive. Initially, some accounts say he tried to establish some order, maybe promise help for the common people. He even declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Qi dynasty.
But the accounts of what happened after he took power, they describe almost unimaginable brutality.
They really escalate from that point. Once he was in power, or perhaps as the situation just deteriorated, the violence became, well, indiscriminate. Any remaining Tang imperial family members in the city were killed. Many officials too.
Just wiped out.
Yeah. There are these chilling lines from a poem that get quoted describing the devastation in the capital. Internal treasury burned to embroidered ashes. The street to the sky try on the bones of high officials. It paints such a grim picture of the scale of killing, especially among the elite he was fighting against.
And then there's that horrific event often referred to as the washing of the city. What was that?
Yes. Apparently, after Tang forces briefly managed to retake Chang'an, they treated the residents cruelly. Then, when Huang Chao recaptured it, out of sheer rage, supposedly because the citizens had cooperated with the Tang, accounts describe him ordering a mass killing of the population.
Just the ordinary people caught in the middle. That's awful.
It's horrifying to contemplate. And then there's another profoundly disturbing account about how his army sustained itself in certain areas when supplies ran out. Sources mention his forces resorting to eating people as food, cannibalism on a mass scale.
Oh my God.
Near a place called Chenzhou. There are specific mentions of something called chengmozai, described as mincing mill forts. According to these accounts, hundreds of thousands of people were consumed there.
Hundreds of thousands. It's hard to even process that kind of horror.
It really is. And while, again, the exact numbers are incredibly difficult to verify and might be exaggerated in the telling, the fact that this practice is recorded at all just underscores the extreme desperation and barbarity that the rebellion reached.
So the total death toll must have been immense.
The estimates run into the millions. Some accounts throw around figures as high as 8 million, though historians generally caution these are likely inflated. But everyone agrees there was widespread killing of civilians on a massive scale.
So that initial stated goal, equalizing wealth, it just completely devolved into something far more brutal and, indiscriminate.
That transformation, or maybe revelation of the underlying reality, is a key part of the historical analysis. Ultimately, Huang Chao was defeated. Tang forces, significantly helped by allies like Li Qiong, eventually crushed the rebellion. Huang Chao himself was killed around 884 AD, over 1140 years ago.
And the immediate impact on the Tang dynasty itself sounds catastrophic.
It was absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
The rebellion severely crippled the Tang central government. It destroyed the crucial economic base in the south. And critically, it massively empowered those regional military governors, the Jidushi.
Ah, the warlords.
Essentially, yes. They were already gaining power, but the chaos allowed them to become basically independent warlords. Their increased strength directly led to the fragmentation of the empire. The Tang dynasty finally collapsed not long after, in 907 AD, about 1118 years ago.
And that collapse led to more chaos.
Yes, it ushered in the really chaotic period known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. Just decades of warfare and instability.
So the immediate legacy was chaos, collapse, fragmentation. But you mentioned earlier there was a longer-term, almost paradoxical historical consequence being discussed.
This is where it gets really interesting, historically speaking. Some historical accounts and analyses suggest that Huang Chao's rebellion, despite its appalling brutality, effectively destroyed many of those old aristocratic clans we talked about earlier. The 5 clans, the 7 noble families.
How? Just through the sheer violence?
Yes. The argument is that his violence physically eliminated many members of these families, destroyed their power bases, and shattered their lineage networks. It sort of cut off the generational transmission of their power, as one source puts it.
He broke the very system that had excluded him just through brute force.
That's the argument presented, and the significant historical consequence, according to this view, is that this destruction, it paved the way for much greater social mobility in the dynasty that followed, the Song dynasty, which began in 960 AD.
How did it change things for, say, ordinary people or those from non-aristocratic backgrounds?
Well, the Song is often described as the first truly commoner society in Chinese history, because those old, entrenched aristocratic families were largely gone, wiped out, or severely weakened. People from more humble backgrounds, those outside the old elite structures, suddenly had a significantly better chance of rising up through the civil service exam system. They could reach positions of real power based more on their own merit and exam performance, rather than just their family name.
Okay, wow. So we have this incredibly complex, undeniably brutal historical figure, Huang Chao. His rebellion was devastating, led to the collapse of an empire, involved horrific violence, but perhaps unintentionally it shattered the stranglehold of an old aristocracy, and some argue it eventually opened doors for commoners centuries later.
That's the complex historical narrative we see emerging from these accounts.
Okay, now let's connect this all back to the present day. Why on earth is this specific figure from over 1100 years ago suddenly so relevant and even, as you said, praised in online discussions today?
Yeah, what these discussions seem to reveal is that for many people online, recent events like the Ms. Dong incident, they've crystallized a feeling that social stratification in China today has reached a really critical level, maybe even an unprecedented one in recent memory.
To the point where they're actually drawing parallels back to that old historical clan system.
Exactly. You see terms being used like new era's clan families or new aristocratic families. They're using this language to describe groups they perceive as controlling social resources today.
And what kind of resources are we talking about?
Well, the discussions highlight this feeling that the advantages most ordinary people strive for their entire lives. Things like getting good jobs, securing city residency permits, those stable government or state-owned enterprise positions often called bianzi. These things feel almost unattainable through conventional effort or merit for many.
But for this perceived new elite, these things are just, starting points? Hand it to them.
Or maybe just stepping stones, entitlements they don't have to fight for in the same grueling way.
Yeah.
This perceived gap, this disparity in effort versus reward, seems to fuel a lot of the online conversation.
And people are actually asking.
Yeah, they're asking questions like, why is the evaluation of Huang Chao getting higher and higher among modern people? Why is this historical figure suddenly being viewed more positively?
And what kind of answers are they giving themselves online?
Well, one very stark answer that seems to be circulating is this. He proved with practical action that breaking in is simpler than testing in.
Wow. Breaking in is simpler than testing in. That directly links Huang Chao's violent overthrow of the old system to a contemporary feeling that the current system is just too difficult, maybe impossible, to navigate successfully through conventional means like exams or hard work.
It really speaks to a palpable sense of despair that's described in some of these online spaces. A feeling that, despite all their effort, their hard work, trying to adapt, people feel they just cannot change their circumstances. And sometimes they feel they can't even safely voice their frustration about it.
And where does that despair lead their thoughts, according to these discussions? What's the connection back to Huang Chao?
It leads them, it seems, to crave a figure like Huang Chao, to reset Chinese society. That's a phrase being used. Or maybe more symbolically, to seek symbols from history that once shook the established order, just to comfort themselves, even if those symbols are associated with, blood and fire.
They're looking for some kind of historical precedent for a fundamental disruption, a reset.
Yes, and they explicitly draw parallels between the old Tang system, based largely on blood lineage, and the current perceived issue, which they describe as this complex integration of blood ties, information access, capital, resources, and power.
Yeah.
All heavily reliant on networks built through family, school, work, marriage, what some call mixing in circles culture.
So it's not just about bloodlines anymore, but a new, perhaps more complex form of entrenched connection and accumulated advantage.
That's the modern comparison being drawn. And these discussions, they highlight the perceived dangers of this, like resources in certain industries becoming monopolized by specific families or interconnected groups, making it incredibly hard for outsiders to enter or compete fairly. Similar, they argue, to the problems with the old clan system, and they see it stemming fundamentally from the issue of power and access.
And given the, let's be blunt, horrific historical reality of Huang Chao's methods, it's noted in these discussions that this online phenomenon of praising him It presents a really complex situation for the government, doesn't it?
Understandably, yes. The historical context, what his actions actually represented in terms of violence and rebellion, makes such discussions highly sensitive.
Yeah. It's understandable maybe why people feeling locked out might look for historical figures who smashed the system, but we absolutely have to balance this with the full historical picture of Huang Chao's actions. The accounts we've looked at are very clear about the other side, the brutality.
That's essential. It's crucial. While some online voices might focus selectively on the outcome disrupting the old elite, the historical records, and indeed critical perspectives within the online discussions themselves, strongly emphasize his incredible brutality, his indiscriminate killing.
Right. His violence wasn't just surgically targeted at the elites he felt had wronged him or blocked him.
No, absolutely not. Accounts describe him as killing red-eyed, massacring civilians alongside officials. The argument is made quite forcefully that whatever his initial revolutionary logic might have been, it very quickly spiraled into just a logic of slaughter.
The supposed ideals just gave way to pure, unrestrained violence.
It's a chilling observation that comes through in these analyses, that while a revolution might start with seemingly beautiful aspirations, like equalizing wealth, it can horribly transform into just violence and killing, sometimes turning on the very people it initially claimed it wanted to help or save. It's described sometimes as a strange or even absurd and peculiar kind of revolutionary logic.
A dark and terrible kind of shift.
And this leads directly to a strong warning that you also find within these discussions. Any emphasis on hatred and violence ultimately leads to no good outcome. That's a direct quote. Another particularly sobering point that's made: when violence is activated, perhaps even those who started it cannot control it.
That feels like a lesson history teaches again and again, doesn't it?
It really does. The clear message, coming both from the historical accounts of Huang Chao and from these critical contemporary viewpoints, is that, well, any kind of violence requires vigilance, extreme caution.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what does this all mean? We've taken this deep dive into Huang Chao. He's this incredibly complex figure from over 1,000 years ago, known for his brutal history as a rebel who violently dismantled the entrenched power of the Tang dynasty's aristocratic clans.
And we've explored why, based on these recent online conversations, often sparked by events like the Miss Dong incident, why this specific historical figure is being revisited and even in some quarters lauded today, linked specifically to these deeply felt concerns about social stratification and a perceived lack of opportunity.
Right. The discussions we've looked at highlight this powerful, albeit quite dark, connection that some people are drawing between historical upheaval and their own contemporary frustrations. It really speaks to a desire, maybe even a craving for radical change when conventional paths just appear blocked or rigged.
But, and this is crucial, the historical accounts and the more critical voices today also offer this stark, unavoidable warning about the nature and the horrific consequences of the extreme violence that Huang Chao unleashed, reminding us of the terrible human cost.
So here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit unsettling. Considering the historical account of Huang Chao's methods, their terrible cost in human lives and suffering, and then contrasting that with this contemporary online sentiment that seems to praise his role, maybe simplifies it, focuses on his role in disrupting the old order. What does this whole phenomenon tell us really about the relationship between deep societal frustration, the way we remember and interpret history, maybe selectively remember it, and the potential appeal of drastic, even violent action? It really raises an important question for all of us, I think. When people feel that systems are completely resistant to change from within, that the doors are locked, where else might they look for answers or for inspiration? And maybe more importantly, what specific lessons from history might they choose to amplify, and which ones might they choose to ignore?